Something very serious happened to American electronics retail, and almost no one talks about it anymore. These 12 major electronics chains didn't just struggle, they vanished completely from the map. I've been researching these companies for years, and what happened to them was not a normal case of an old business fading out. This is the story of stores that once had more locations than McDonald's, turning into empty buildings and forgotten names in less than a decade. Some collapsed in a single announcement. Others bled out slowly over years of layoffs and store closures. But the most important part is this. The deeper cause wasn't just the internet. It was these companies destroying the one advantage no website could ever compete with: a staff you could actually trust. Number 12, Silo. A name that once meant something specific in Midwestern living rooms. Silo. For years, Silo was a regional appliance and electronics chain that operated on a foundation that larger national competitors rarely managed to replicate. Fair prices sold by people who actually lived in the communities they served. The salespeople at a Silo store weren't just employees following a script handed down from a corporate office. They were neighbors, people who understood what the families walking through the door actually needed because they were part of the same community. That local connection gave Silo a trust that national chains spent enormous amounts of money trying to manufacture and never quite achieved. Customers came back not just because the prices were competitive, but because the experience of buying there felt genuine, rather than transactional. But that foundation started cracking the moment larger corporations acquired the chain in the 1980s. Decisions that had once been made by people who understood the stores and the communities they served started coming from head offices that had never set foot inside a Silo location. Staff training budgets were cut. The floor expertise that had built the brand's reputation thinned out steadily as the people who knew the products and the customers were replaced by cheaper, less knowledgeable hires. The local trust that had taken years to build started eroding in ways that couldn't be reversed by advertising or promotions. Customers who had once walked in knowing they would get honest guidance started feeling like they were being sold to rather than helped. Once that distinction disappeared, there was no longer a compelling reason to choose Silo over any other option. By the mid-1990s, Silo had disappeared from the American retail map entirely. Its buildings were converted into other stores or left standing empty for years. A chain built entirely on local trust discovered the hard way that once that trust is gone, there is very little left to save. Number 11, Incredible Universe. In 1992, RadioShack's parent company Tandy Corporation opened something that American retail had genuinely never seen before. Incredible Universe stores measured 185,000 square feet. To put that in perspective, that is larger than most warehouses and roughly 3 times the size of a typical big-box electronics store. But the square footage was only part of the story. Inside these enormous buildings, Tandy built go-kart tracks, laser tag arenas, and stages for live music performances. The idea was to turn a shopping trip into an experience that families would plan their weekend around rather than treat as an errand to get through quickly. For a few years, it worked in exactly that way. Families came to Incredible Universe not just to buy electronics, but to spend time inside a building that felt more like an entertainment venue than a store. The spectacle was genuinely impressive, and the foot traffic reflected that. But running buildings that size required an enormous number of employees just to keep the basic operations functioning. And as the company looked for ways to control the staggering costs associated with maintaining these massive spaces, the depth of product knowledge on the sales floor was one of the first things to get cut. Customers who had come for the spectacle and stayed hoping to get a real question answered started finding themselves wandering an enormous warehouse with almost nobody around who could help them make an informed decision. The entertainment experience that had drawn them in couldn't compensate for the absence of the expertise that should have been there waiting. By 1996, just 4 years after the first location opened, every single Incredible Universe store in the country had closed permanently. Several of the massive buildings sat empty for more than a decade afterward because almost no other retailer in America needed that much space or knew what to do with it. Number 10. Ultimate Electronics. Ultimate Electronics built its name and its reputation across Colorado and the Mountain West as the place serious buyers went when they wanted a real home theater system, designed and installed properly, rather than just a television pulled off a shelf and loaded into a cart. The difference wasn't just the products, it was the staff. People who understood acoustics and speaker placement and the specific technical requirements of building a home theater that actually performed the way it was supposed to. That level of expertise justified paying more at Ultimate Electronics than at a big box competitor, and for customers who cared about getting it right, the premium felt worth it. The chain developed a genuinely loyal following in the markets it served, built almost entirely on the strength of that specialized knowledge. But the financial pressures of competing in the broader electronics retail market eventually pushed the company toward decisions that undermined the very thing that made it worth choosing. The company filed for bankruptcy for the first time in 2005. It reorganized and attempted to keep the operation going, but the restructuring required rapid expansion into new markets to generate the revenue needed to survive. Expanding quickly meant hiring staff faster than the company could properly train them. The technical expertise that had once been the brand's defining characteristic started disappearing from store floors as new employees who hadn't been given the time or resources to develop genuine knowledge replaced the specialists who had built the chain's reputation. Customers who had paid a premium specifically for that expertise started noticing the difference and started questioning whether the premium was still justified. In 2011, Ultimate Electronics filed for bankruptcy a second time. This time, there was no reorganization and no recovery. Every remaining store closed for good, leaving behind a customer base that had genuinely valued what the chain offered at its best and had watched it slowly become something else entirely before it disappeared. Number 9. Nobody beats the Whiz. If you grew up in the New York tri-state area during the 1980s or 1990s, the jingle is probably still somewhere in your memory. Nobody beats the Whiz. It played constantly on television and radio, and it worked because the promise behind it felt real. The entire brand was built on a single guarantee that was both simple and genuinely compelling. The lowest price anywhere matched on the spot. No exceptions, no arguments, no fine print to wade through. Walk in, find a lower price somewhere else, and the Whiz would match it immediately. For customers in one of the most competitive retail markets in the country, that promise was powerful enough to build an entire chain around. And for years, the promise held up in practice, which is what made the brand genuinely trusted rather than just loudly marketed. But as national competition intensified through the 1990s, and as the electronics retail landscape became increasingly crowded with chains making similar claims, the guarantee that had built Nobody Beats the Whiz started becoming harder to actually use in the way customers expected. The straightforward promise that had once been matched on the spot began accumulating exclusions. Model number technicalities that conveniently meant the exact television a competitor was selling cheaper wasn't technically the same model. Fine print that hadn't been there before started appearing around a guarantee that had originally been presented as having none. Customers who had chosen the Whiz specifically because of that promise started discovering that the promise wasn't quite as simple as the jingle had made it sound. The one thing the entire brand had been built around stopped being reliable in the hands of the people who were supposed to deliver it. In 2003, Nobody Beats the Whiz filed for bankruptcy, and its remaining stores were sold off and rebranded under P.C. Richard & Son. The jingle is still remembered by an entire generation of New Yorkers. The stores are not. Number 8. The Good Guys across the West Coast, through the 1980s and into the 1990s. The Good Guys built an identity that was genuinely different from what the larger electronics chains were offering. The name itself was a promise about the kind of experience customers could expect when they walked through the door. Friendly staff who actually loved electronics. People who could talk about products with the kind of enthusiasm and depth of knowledge that came from genuine interest, rather than a training manual read the week before. In a retail category that was increasingly dominated by high-pressure, commission-driven sales environments, the Good Guys positioned itself as the alternative. The place where the person helping you seemed more interested in matching you with the right product than in hitting a personal sales target for the month. That positioning resonated strongly with West Coast customers who valued the experience of buying as much as the product they were buying. The chain grew steadily and built a loyal following that kept coming back because the experience consistently delivered on what the name promised. But as competition from Circuit City and Best Buy intensified across the markets where the Good Guys operated, the company made decisions that gradually eroded the very thing that had set it apart. Commission structures were shifted to reward sales volume over service quality. Pay stagnated while expectations increased. Staff turnover climbed as the employees who had embodied the brand's identity found fewer reasons to stay. The floor expertise that had justified the name started becoming inconsistent and then increasingly hard to find on any given visit. After being acquired in 2001, the remaining stores were converted or closed entirely by 2003. A name that had been genuinely inescapable on West Coast television for 2 decades disappeared within just a couple of years of the acquisition. The good guys turned out to be replaceable the moment the company stopped investing in what made them good. Number 7. Tweeter started in New England in 1972 with a focus so specific that it almost defied the logic of mass-market retail. This was not a store for everyone. It was a store for people who cared deeply about sound. Audiophiles who wanted equipment matched precisely to their listening environment by staff who understood acoustics, speaker sensitivity, room dimensions, and the technical variables that separate a genuinely impressive home audio setup from one that simply looks impressive on paper. For that specific customer, Tweeter became something genuinely irreplaceable. The staff weren't just knowledgeable in a general sense, they were specialists who could have a real technical conversation with a serious buyer and earn that buyer's trust in the process. That trust translated into premium prices that customers were willing to pay because they felt the expertise was worth it. For decades, that model worked, and Tweeter built a devoted following across New England that treated the stores as a resource rather than just a retailer. But the financial pressures of competing in a retail category increasingly dominated by big box chains pushed Tweeter toward a decision that would prove impossible to reverse. The company began expanding nationally in the early 2000s, moving into new markets rapidly to build the scale needed to compete with larger competitors. Expanding that quickly meant opening stores faster than the company could staff them with people who had the specialist knowledge that Tweeter's reputation had been built on. The depth of expertise that had defined the brand in New England got spread thin across too many new locations too quickly. Customers who had paid a premium specifically for genuine specialist guidance started noticing that the answers they were getting sounded more like a training manual than a real specialist. The premium that had once felt completely justified started feeling harder to defend. Tweeter filed for bankruptcy in 2007, and by 2008, every remaining store had closed. A casualty of the same recession that damaged the entire industry but weakened significantly by years of erosion in the exact thing that had once made it special. Number 6. Crazy Eddie. His prices are insane. If you lived in the New York area at any point during the 1970s or 1980s, that phrase is almost certainly burned permanently into your memory. Crazy Eddie built its entire identity around a single screamed promise, delivered at maximum volume by a spokesman whose on-screen energy felt genuinely unhinged in a way that was impossible to ignore or forget. The lowest prices anywhere guaranteed. For years, that promise checked out at the register, which is what made the brand work. Customers who tested the guarantee found that it actually held up in practice, and that combination of an unforgettable marketing presence and a promise that delivered built Crazy Eddie into one of the most recognizable retail brands in the New York market. But behind the scenes, the reality of what was happening at Crazy Eddie bore almost no relationship to the image the advertising created. The company was engaged in one of the most brazen and extensively documented accounting frauds in American retail history. Inventory was being systematically inflated on paper to make the company appear far more valuable than it actually was. While customers on the floor were increasingly running into bait-and-switch tactics and high-pressure sales strategies that contradicted the easy, no-pressure image the advertising projected, the books were being manipulated to deceive investors and auditors simultaneously. The fraud went on for years before investigators began closing in. Once customers started suspecting that the famous guarantee was more theater than reality, the entire brand started collapsing because the guarantee was genuinely the only thing Crazy Eddie had ever really sold. By 1989, the fraud had been exposed publicly. The founder had fled the country, the entire chain was liquidated, and one of the loudest, most memorable retail brands in New York history ended not with a bankruptcy restructuring or a quiet wind-down, but with a federal investigation and a founder living as a fugitive. Number 5. HHGregg. Founded in Indiana in 1955, HHGregg grew for decades on a promise that felt almost old-fashioned in the best possible way. Appliances and electronics sold by staff who were paid and trained well enough that you could actually trust their recommendation the way you would trust advice from a neighbor who happened to know a lot about televisions and washing machines. That trust was the foundation everything else was built on. Customers came back not just because HHGregg had what they needed, but because the experience of buying there felt genuinely helpful rather than transactional. But as online competition began compressing margins across the entire electronics retail category, the company started looking for ways to protect its bottom line. The answer it landed on was a harder push into commission-based upselling and extended warranty sales that carried significantly better margins than the products themselves. Customers started noticing that the recommendations they received in-store seemed to align more closely with what earned the highest commission than with what actually made the most sense for their home or their budget. The trust that had taken decades to build started eroding quietly but steadily. Once customers stopped believing that the advice they were getting was genuinely in their interest, the thing that made HHGregg different from every other electronics retailer disappeared. There was no longer a compelling reason to choose HHGregg over ordering online and waiting 2 days for delivery. The company filed for bankruptcy in March 2017, and unable to find a buyer willing to take on the struggling operation, it liquidated all 220 remaining stores within months. A 62-year-old company that had built its entire identity around trustworthy service disappeared from American retail almost overnight. Number 4. Fry's Electronics. Founded in Silicon Valley in 1985, Fry's Electronics became legendary in a way that very few retail chains ever achieve. The stores themselves were destinations before you even looked at what was on the shelves. Each location was built around a wild, immersive theme: ancient Egypt, outer space, the Wild West, Alice in Wonderland. Walking into a Fry's for the first time felt genuinely unlike anything else in retail. But beyond the theatrics, Fry's delivered something that engineers, hobbyists, and technology professionals valued even more than the decor: inventory depth that was almost unbelievable by any retail standard. If you needed a single obscure electronic component at 9 o'clock on a Tuesday night, Fry's had it. If you needed a full server rack configured to specific requirements, Fry's had that too. The promise was simple, and it held for decades. Whatever you needed, no matter how specialized, no matter what time of day, Fry's would have it waiting on a shelf somewhere in that enormous building. For Silicon Valley's engineering community, that promise made Fry's genuinely irreplaceable. But as online retailers developed the infrastructure to make same-day and next-day delivery possible for those same obscure components, the massive physical footprint that had been Fry's greatest strength became its most significant liability. Maintaining enormous store spaces stocked with deep niche inventory is extraordinarily expensive. As online alternatives improved, the shelves that once brimmed with specialized parts started thinning out as the company cut inventory to reduce costs. The experience that had made Fry's legendary started degrading in the very area that mattered most to its most loyal customers. In February 2021, with almost no warning, Fry's announced the permanent closure of all 31 remaining stores through a brief notice posted on its website. An institution that had shaped Silicon Valley's supply chain and defined the electronics retail experience for an entire generation of engineers vanished in a single press release. Number 3. CompUSA. When CompUSA opened its first computer superstore in 1984, it introduced an idea that had never existed before in American retail: an entire building dedicated entirely to computers, not a department inside a larger store, not a small specialty shop with limited inventory. An entire superstore staffed by people who actually understood the machines they were selling. Not just how to ring them up, but how they worked, what they were capable of, and which one made sense for what a specific customer actually needed. In the early days of personal computing, when most people were still trying to understand what a computer even was, that level of knowledgeable guidance was genuinely valuable. CompUSA grew on the strength of that value proposition, expanding across the country as personal computers moved from novelty to necessity in American homes and offices. But as the 1990s and 2000s progressed, the margins on PC hardware compressed dramatically. Computers became commodities. The price difference between buying at CompUSA and buying from an online retailer grew harder and harder to justify on the basis of in-store expertise alone. The company responded by shifting its focus toward software and accessories that carried better margins. Staff incentives changed to match. Employees were increasingly rewarded for selling whatever generated the best commission rather than whatever actually solved the customer's problem. The knowledgeable guidance that had built CompUSA's reputation gradually gave way to the same kind of pressure selling that customers could find anywhere. The reason to choose CompUSA over a cheaper online alternative faded with it. By 2007, the majority of company-owned CompUSA stores had closed. The remaining locations were converted to a franchise model that continued shrinking before disappearing almost entirely within a few more years. The idea of the dedicated computer superstore which CompUSA had invented outlived the company that created it. Number 2. Circuit City. For decades, Circuit City was the electronics chain that every competitor measured itself against. It wasn't just the selection or the store layouts or the advertising, It was the salespeople. Circuit City built its reputation on a commissioned sales staff whose product knowledge ran deep enough that customers could actually rely on what they were told. Walking in with a question about which television or which car stereo or which home audio system made sense for a specific situation and getting a genuinely informed answer was the experience that kept people coming back year after year. That reputation took decades to build. In March 2007, Circuit City made a decision that is now studied in business schools as one of the clearest examples of a company destroying its own core value in pursuit of a short-term financial target. The company fired roughly 3,400 of its most experienced and highest-paid sales staff, replacing them with cheaper, less-trained hires, in a move designed to cut costs quickly. The logic on paper was straightforward. Lower labor costs meant better margins. But the experienced employees who were let go were precisely the people whose knowledge had made Circuit City worth choosing over a cheaper alternative. Customers noticed the change almost immediately. Questions that a veteran employee would have answered confidently and accurately now got a shrug or an uncertain guess. The trust that had taken years to earn started disappearing within months. Sales declined. The gap between Circuit City and its competitors, that had once felt like an advantage, reversed direction entirely. Just 2 years after that decision, in 2009, Circuit City liquidated, completely closing nearly 600 remaining stores and laying off more than 30,000 employees. A company that had spent decades building something genuinely valuable destroyed its own core reason for existing to hit a short-term cost target and was gone within 2 years of doing it. Number 1. RadioShack. At its peak, RadioShack operated more than 8,000 stores across America, more locations than McDonald's. The "You've got questions, we've got answers" slogan wasn't just marketing. For generations of hobbyists, engineers, students, and curious people who needed to understand how something worked or find the exact component to make something work, RadioShack was genuinely the answer. Roughly 94% of Americans lived within a few minutes of a RadioShack location at the chain's height. That kind of presence in everyday life is almost impossible to overstate. The store was part of the landscape in a way that went beyond retail. It was a resource, a place where someone with a specific technical problem could walk in and find both the part and the person who understood why they needed it. But as big-box electronics retailers and eventually the internet turned basic electronics components into commodities that could be ordered from anywhere and delivered quickly, RadioShack faced a fundamental question about what it still offered, that customers couldn't get more easily somewhere else. The answer the company landed on was aggressive commission-driven upselling, battery clubs, cell phone plan sales, service contracts, extended warranties, pushed onto customers regardless of what they had actually come in to buy. Staff were pressured to collect personal information at every single checkout transaction, creating an experience that felt increasingly intrusive and transactional. A trip in for a $9 battery turned into a gauntlet of pitches and requests that most customers found exhausting rather than helpful. The simple, no-pressure certainty that had once defined the RadioShack experience was gone, and nothing replaced it except the sense that the store needed something from you every time you walked through the door. RadioShack filed for bankruptcy in 2015, closing over 1,700 stores. It filed again in 2017, closing hundreds more. By 2020, a name that had once meant more locations than McDonald's had shrunk to a handful of licensed kiosks and an online storefront running almost entirely on the memory of what RadioShack used to be, closing 12 stores, 12 different collapses. But look closely, and the same pattern shows up again and again. None of these companies lost because a competitor had better prices. Most of them had prices competitive with anyone else on the market. They lost because they destroyed the one thing no website could ever replace: a staff and a promise you could actually trust. Once that was gone, there was no reason left to drive to the store instead of clicking Buy Now. The buildings are still standing in most of these towns today. Different names hang above the doors now. But for an entire generation, the memory of what used to be inside hasn't disappeared at all.